That night they made camp on the southern edge of the bogs, halfway between the King's Road and the river. It was there Theon Greyjoy brought them further word from her uncle.
Sir Brynden says to tell you he's crossed swords with the Lannisters. There are a dozen scouts who won't be reporting back to Lord Tywin anytime soon, or ever.
He grinned.
Sir Adam Marbrand commands their outriders, and he's pulling back south, burning as he goes. He knows where we are, more or less, but the Blackfish vows he will not know when we split.
Unless Lord Frey tells him,
Catelyn said sharply.
Theon, when you return to my uncle, tell him he is to place his best bowmen around the twins day and night, with orders to bring down any raven they see leaving the battlements. I want no birds bringing word of my son's movements to Lord Tywin.
Sir Brynden has seen to it already, my lady,
Theon replied with a cocky smile.
A few more blackbirds and we should have enough to bake a pie. I'll save you their feathers for a hat.
She ought to have known that Brynden Blackfish would be well ahead of her.
Brotherhood is a strong aspect within A Song of Ice and Fire's great collection of character-based themes, with Jaime and Tyrion, Robb and Jon, the three Baratheons as prime examples, and, well, there's plenty of others. I don't need to list them. These are very familiar, of course, because we've seen a lot of these brotherly interactions firsthand through various POVs. But of course, these relationships exist in the past as well, through older generations, the so-called puppet masters whose strings our main characters dance upon, who in turn danced upon the strings of their parents. Sir Brynden Tully, aka Blackfish, certainly had to do his share of dancing, not only to his parents and the conditions of the realm around him, but to his brother's tune. And that was a cause for a lot of conflict. And that conflict indirectly led him to being in the right place at the right time to come help save the day and assist Robb Stark establish his new kingdom. Now, even as that kingdom and its king has fallen, Blackfish continues the struggle. So hello and welcome to another episode of History of Westeros podcast. It's good to be back covering the books again after a while. It's so much fun to dive into the much greater level of detail. We couldn't possibly do a full episode on TV Blackfish. There just isn't enough to go on. We would have to draw on book material to fill in the gaps, or maybe it would be a really short episode. But this, the political conditions of a time when he was born, throughout the time now, there's just so much to get into, and really excited to be doing this. Want to give a few bits of thanks before we get to the meat and material. I want to thank our co-writers, mostly Joe Buckley, who wrote about half of this episode, and Rhaenys Targaryen, whose timeline expertise was particularly valuable in this episode because we don't have precise dates on either Brynden or Hoster's birth, nor Edmure, and a lot of these other Tullys, so playing with these ranges of dates makes it a little trickier than when we have precise dates. But in any case, we nailed a lot down. You're going to like it. Also want to give thanks to our patrons. That is led off by Jeff Gnarly, the Long Snapper, History of Westeros' first sword.
And our Dragon Rider patrons, Lord Mark of House Joseph, the Snow in Winterfell, rider of Mazalacartho, a white dragon with green scales, horns, wings, and talons, Talanis the Talon, King of Gogassos, rider of Telarius, a red dragon with scales, horns, and talons of midnight black, Jinx of House Lier, Green Queen of the Rainwood, rider of Erogenia, a sylphic albino dragon with amethyst eyes and opalescent wings.
We're going back to the time of Sir Brynden Tully, the Blackfish's early days before he had either a nickname or even a ser. He might not be your first thought when either of these subjects are brought up. He's an unmarried uncle and he doesn't have any descendants of his own, but he is a family man despite that, and he's pulled quite a few strings of his own, especially that of his brother, who was, of course, pulling his strings. Or perhaps it would be better to say he didn't pull strings so much as refused to let his own be pulled. And when a puppet doesn't behave the way that its master wants, it kind of has a trickle-down or trickle-up effect. Brynden's repeated refusals to marry, for example, had a difficult to determine but clearly significant impact on Lord Hoster's plans. In general, his impact on politics was significant but indirect, though it is not his forte, and it is something he, like many soldiers, disdains. In addition to refusing to be part of the game, he was, is, and will continue to be, if you ask us, a major player when it comes to warfare. And warfare is a major part of the game. Even modern soldiers are told to use the KISS principle as often as possible. KISS stands for keep it simple, stupid. So when I say the soldierly way is the simple way, it's not an insult. It's, in fact, the opposite. Keeping things simple is a form of wisdom. Making things complicated doesn't make you smarter. Sometimes it does the opposite. And what house makes its goals simpler than House Tully? Family, duty, honor. in that order, right? Well, maybe not, but usually. And Blackfish is named so because he's different. His nickname derives from his brother naming him a maverick. That's the implication of that black sheep of the family cliche that gets thrown around in our world as well as in Westeros. And this is what Hoster Tully was referring to, except he, called him a goat instead of a sheep. Same difference. But even when he left Hoster, his brother, and didn't perform his marriage duties as custom demands, he went to go guard Hoster's daughter Lysa. And many years later, when he left Lysa's service, he did it to go fight for Riverrun and the king in the north, who, do not forget, Robb is half Tully himself and looks like a Tully. That's family and duty right there, for example. And as for honor, well, even the Blackfish's bitterest foes believe he deserves a noble death. Being a great warrior and commander who stays out of politics, that's a really good way to be considered honorable and to be respected. Now, not getting your hands dirty in politics is a little different than getting your hands dirty in war. Westerosi respect the latter a lot more than the former, generally speaking. And Brynden Blackfish is one of the most famous knights in the land, period. He has a major influence on the War of Five Kings, and he's a huge figure in the life of one of our main POV characters, Catelyn. He appears poised to play a continuing role as well, a topic with many subtopics that we will explore fully by the end of this episode. Brynden Tully also sparks some debate, whether he's just a good man, a selfish, self-contained old grump, or somewhere in between. Whichever is true, Brynden is multifaceted and complicated, as you would expect coming from George. He is the type of man who's simultaneously fondly regarded as a warm parent by Catelyn, even though he's not a parent, and revered as a hero by young Jaime Lannister, all while having long-standing mysteries of his own. The Brynden we meet in this series is aged, nearing his 60s, which is an accomplishment for any man in Westeros, let alone a seasoned warrior. Surviving that long is hard. And yet he remains at least reminiscent of the young warrior he was. Even if he isn't quite as quick or strong as he once was, his abilities as a commander have only grown. He's always been brave, but over the years he's accrued experience, glory, and his fame has spread. He's basically now a living legend. But this is the History of Westeros podcast, so we have to go back to the past before we reach present Brynden, find what earned him his fame and adulation.
Early life.
Between 238 and 240 AC, a new heir was born to the Lord of Riverrun, and he was named Hoster, the future father of Catelyn, Lysa, and Edmure. While he was born to inherit, as we knew he later did, his first heir would have been his younger brother, born some 5 years later, between 242 and 245, and that's our subject, Brynden.
No ordinary name.
While Blackfish is a standout nickname that is used more often than his real name, Brynden is an extremely notable name, as Brynden Rivers, aka Bloodraven, had recently become Lord Commander of the Night's Watch after a long, famous, or perhaps infamous career as Hand of the King.
A Dance with Dragons, Brand 3. I have an Uncle Brynden. He's my mother's uncle, really. Brynden Blackfish, he's called, Bran said.
Your uncle may have been named for me. Some are still, not so many as before. Men forget. Only the trees remember.
May have been named for me is technically correct, but clearly an understatement. Sure, they might just like the name, but it's literally impossible that the Lord and Lady of Riverrun didn't somehow take note of the fact that Bloodraven, famous in the realm for decades, the son of the king and Melissa Blackwood, who's a vassal of the Tullys, was named Brynden as well. I mean, come on, that can't just be coincidence. But Bloodraven isn't the only connection to the crown, so it gets deeper. In fact, another Blackwood was even closer. The Queen of Westeros, in fact, was a Blackwood herself, none other than Black Betha. And when Brynden was born, she had been queen for 9 years, or roughly, at least 9 years. And this nod to a Blackwood may not have pleased the Brackens, but they surely would have less hatred for this particular Brynden, especially compared to Bloodraven, right? The current Lord Bracken, Jonos, as in around the time of where the books are now, tells Jaime, I'm fond of the man, I won't deny that. And Hoster reveals when he's near death that Lord Bracken had offered his daughter to marry Blackfish. That was one of the many marriages that Blackfish rejected. And this is probably Lord Jonas' sister that we're talking about, since we're about one generation back when that offer was made. The Tullys had a perfect record of siding with the crown against the Blackfires, and were notable for their support of Aegon the Conqueror himself, meaning that the Tullys had a long record of backing House Targaryen. And one of the first hands of the king for Aegon the Conqueror was a Tully. Brynden is a name ripe with meaning, given all this history of the Targaryens and the Tullys and the Blackwoods. And you might say, wait a sec, Hoster Tully turned on House Targaryen at the outset of Robert's Rebellion. What are you talking about, perfect record? Well, they had a perfect record. They just don't anymore. And it's always been easy to justify Hoster turning on Aerys. Anyone turning on Aerys had fairly good justification, especially those families who were directly impacted. But there's more to it than that. And it happened right around the time we're dealing with. Something was to come that would shake up that loyalty, and what was once a stable and proud tradition of the Tully dynasty would begin to erode right before the time Blackfish was born.
The Royal Tully Bombs.
This period of time would prove quite famous for births of major characters, including the mothers and fathers of many of the adults who are now in their primes. Tywin, Kevin, and Jenna Lannister, all born around this time. Aerys Targaryen himself a little before. Steffon Baratheon around this time. Barristan Selmy is about 6 to 9 years older than Blackfish, and given how those two are compared a lot, and how these men would interact at major points throughout the coming half-century or so, it's interesting how close they are in birth. Perhaps due to their staunch loyalty or esteem or for reasons outside of our knowledge, House Tully maintained those ties dating back to the conquest. A certain Celia Tully, at this time, was daughter of the Lord of Riverrun, betrothed to Jaehaerys, the second son of King Aegon V the Unlikely, in the year 237. And this is about 5 to 8 years before Brynden was born, and only about a year or 3 before Hoster's. So there's a chance that she, the Celia Tully that is, was their elder sister. But it's more likely she was their aunt. For reasons too lengthy to bring up here, just trust our timeline expert Rhaenys. I double-checked her work, and I agree with that conclusion. But there's also a third possibility, which is that she's like a half-sister. Maybe this Lord of Riverrun married more than once. That happens sometimes. 2 years later, though, Prince Duncan the Small renounced his claim as the king's heir in order to marry his beloved common girl Jenny of Oldstones. And that made Jaehaerys the heir to the throne, which meant Celia was on track to be a Tully queen of Westeros, something never before seen. Soon came a revolt in the Stormlands as Duncan was betrothed to Lorne Lyle Baratheon's daughter, and his daughter was marrying the crown prince. Of course, that's Duncan, so he lost out on that, which is a big deal. I thought you were going to have your daughter become the queen, and then, sorry, that's canceled. You would wonder how the Tullys would react to this. They wouldn't be happy that this betrothal was broken publicly, but on the other hand, that made Celia, in line to become queen. So they would probably assist the crown in this rebellion to set down the Baratheons. So imagine their disappointment, the Tullys that is, when a year later, not unlike Lyanna and his own grandson Rhaegar, Prince Jaehaerys snuck off with his sister Prince Shera, and they married in secret and consummated it. And they were legitimately in love, and King Aegon and Queen Betha Blackwood just accepted the marriage at that point. There wasn't much they could do. This very much upset Lord Tully, as well as Lord Tyrell, whose son Luthor instead married a queen rather than Princess Shera. The Queen of Thorns, that is, not a Targaryen. It likely upset much of the Reach and Riverlands as well, because, hey, the Riverlands was probably feeling kind of proud about the prospect of Celia becoming queen. That would have been the second straight Riverlands queen, because Betha Blackwood, was queen before. But unlike the Stormlands, the Riverlands and Reach didn't actually rebel. But we all know houses hate to be humiliated like this. Not everyone reacts as poorly to losing their crack at having a queen in their family as, say, Walder Frey, another Riverlands house, nor even Lionel Baratheon. Nonetheless, just because they didn't rebel doesn't mean it wasn't a huge insult. Well, we're told that it was exactly that. So with Hoster Tully being the future heir, he spent his childhood being raised for lordship by a father who had suffered this particularly great insult at the hands of House Targaryen. So from a very early age, this was, in his sphere of existence, and it probably sank in. It would likely be years before his family set this hurt aside, if ever, and thus Brynden also would have been raised in this attitude alongside this recent insult that may have been a big part of what they believed. Remember all this in particular when we get to Robert's Rebellion. As men and women of honor all over Westeros struggled, oath to liege or mad king, which do we do? It's a tough choice, but if you had some sort of insult from a previous generation, well, that might tip the scales, and House Tully had a particular insult that I've just mentioned, so you can see why they sided with the non-Targaryens. Of course, there's other reasons for that, the Southron conspiracy talk and all that, but still, this insult probably mattered on top of all that. But when Robert's Rebellion broke out, Blackfish was about 40. So we got a lot of history between now and then to cover. So let's move away from the setting in which he was born and move on to the man himself.
The Blackfish Knight.
Okay, so he hadn't actually earned that nickname yet, and he wears the Tully colors most of the time, but we're going to use it now to simplify and to differentiate him from Bloodraven. Too many Bryndens in these parts. Blackfish was apparently knighted in his mid-teens, which is very much on the early side of things. This also means that his father, who died in 264 or later, lived to see his son achieve this honor. Though unfortunately, we don't have any details on what he did to get knighted so fast, but considering his personality, the type of man he was and still is, it's not hard to guess that it was just general greatness, general talent, just good with the sword, brave, all that stuff. That's basically what gets you knighthood in the early days anyway. So it's probably that. As we see with multiple other characters like Robb, Brynden, being a second son, was set on a different path as his brother. Not unlike that of Ned Stark, right? Robb and Jon had much different paths. Brynden's not a bastard, but you can kind of see the difference between a first son and a second son. Like Bran. Bran is the second son, and he thought he was going to become a knight. And that's basically the track that Brynden was on, being a second son. Kind of like Ned Stark, also a second son, but the Riverlands equivalent, which is knighthood instead of, the northern equivalent, which doesn't really have a name. And of course, a lot of second, third, etc. sons become better fighters than their firstborn brothers. And it just makes sense, right? Because they get to focus on fighting while the firstborn has to learn how to rule and all these other things in addition to learning how to fight. So it pays to focus on one thing. As Brynden Blackfish, nicknamed after our subject today, aka Jeff Hartline, has noted in his Blood of the Conqueror series, there's a kind of a set road for knighthood with milestones, right? You're a page, then you're a squire, and then you eventually become a knight, earning your spurs. Now, Brynden followed this model, though we don't know if he actually did the page thing. Some people skip that. He may have done that, but maybe not. What we do know is that he was sent off to squire, along with Norbert, the future Lord of House Vance, at Castle Derry. Now, House Derry was noted for its staunch loyalty to House Targaryen, so that might come up later. We don't know the name of this particular Lord Derry, but looking at the dates, it's pretty likely the father of Raymond Derry, and Raymond was Lord of Derry at the beginning of the series. He's dead now. So as you would expect, not only is Brynden being trained in arms from a young age, he's rubbing shoulders with his father's vassals and other people around, establishing ties and friendships, as we see every smart family do in Westeros. And of course, he's leaving an impact because, as we said, everyone in Westeros, with few exceptions, really respects people who are good at fighting. So anywhere Brynden went, probably he was impressing people. And as we see, even from his enemies, even when he's old, again, this richest form of social currency, martial skill, comes up again. He's so often compared to Barristan Selmy, and Selmy is often considered one of the best we've ever heard of from any era. And Selmy was more of a white knight, right? I mean, he wears the colors white even because of the Kingsguard. Brynden's more of a black knight. Through the whole of his life to this point, the king had been Aegon V, the Unlikely, right? Brother of Maester Aemon. Egg. This is Egg we're talking about. He's the one who sent Bloodraven to the wall. Politics aside, he seemed to have a lot in common with his namesake, right? Obviously, we just talked about how Blackfish doesn't get involved in politics too much, and Bloodraven was very involved. But outside of that, skilled archer, skilled swordsman, skilled at controlling information. Blackfish's skill with information control is battlefield information, not the politics, not Master of Whispers type stuff. We're talking about killing ravens and enemy scouts. all that, while deploying scouts and messengers of his own. He understands this probably better than anyone we know. And we see him nail that shot in his brother's funeral scene, right? Lighting the funeral boat on fire from a distance. His namesake, Bloodraven, vanished beyond the wall, officially speaking circa 252, when Brynden himself, Blackfish, would have been around 7 to 10 years old. So there's no chance that they had contact, face to face, but perhaps some of the lords of the Riverlands employed some of his personal guard. And certainly they told stories. But the Raven's teeth, many of them, that's Bloodraven's personal guard, many of them took the Black with him, but given that many of them did, not all, well, where did they go? A lot of them maybe went to get jobs with different lords around the realm. Having been with Bloodraven gives them a little extra clout, and maybe some of them went around as trainers or masters at arms, and maybe Brynden had some contact with some of these guys. This Black Knight versus White Knight concept is something I want to come back to, because I think it's really interesting to consider. Typically, the Black Knight is associated with evil, but not really in Westeros, and certainly not the case with Brynden Tully. I wouldn't call him chivalrous, though. He's not really a knight who puts protecting the weak particularly high on his list, at least not the weak commonborn. Weak members of his family, maybe. Duty sounds noble, but consider that Sandor Clegane was doing his duty when he killed Micah. Corran Halfhand would surely approve of duty before honor, for example. Remember that he told Jon that their personal honor means nothing next to their duty to protect the realm. What the Night's Watch gives up is their families, and that's the first word for House Tully, though. So that's where the comparison kind of falls apart. But contrast this to Selmy, who also gave up his inheritance, leaving his family, right? He doesn't protect them at all. He's given them up entirely. Even though taking the white brings honor to your family, it means you're no longer really a part of the family. So it's kind of a weird dichotomy. And the Night's Watch, like Selmy's oath to the Kingsguard, is gone. I mean, this is a lifelong oath they give. So he's kind of left his family. I always thought that was kind of an odd little thing to square. Blackfish wasn't doing that kind of thing. And it's funny, though, despite not joining one of these martial orders like the Night's Watch or the Kingsguard, he really lives a lot like one of them. Didn't have his own family, right? And the Night's Watch puts duty first. The Kingsguard focuses on protecting one particular family, right? The Blackfish is also kind of focused on protecting one particular family. It's just his, not the royal family. He's kind of like a Kingsguard to his own house, who gets to leave whenever he wants, because he didn't actually swear an oath. So he has more freedom than a Kingsguard or Man of the Watch, but he exercises basically none of these freedoms except for, leaving Lysa and leaving Hoster. But basically, he's just as chaste, just as dutiful, just as dedicated as any of the best from either the Night's Watch or the Kingsguard. And that kind of makes me wonder why he was never chosen for Aerys or Jaehaerys' Kingsguard. Maybe he didn't want to be. But it could be that several, if not most, or all of the Kingsguard died at Summerhall before Brynden was famous. So you would think that that was a time when maybe the ranks were thin, and someone like him who was kind of coming into his own might have been the guy to take a place. But maybe not. Maybe there's more to it. If not for Aerys making his move and giving a white cloak to Jaime, maybe it would have been Blackfish. But again, maybe he would have refused. Not that refusing the Kingsguard is something that comes up much, but Blackfish, I could see him doing that. I could see him being different, because he's different so many other ways. And not that having Jaime at court worked out for Aerys. But Blackfish, can you imagine him at court? I don't know. He just doesn't seem to fit, right? He doesn't mince words like Varys or even Selmy. Selmy's straightforward with battles, right? He's an open kind of guy. But he's very careful with his words. He speaks politely. He doesn't want to offend. Meanwhile, Blackfish is the opposite in both cases. He's different in that he says what's on his mind, and he conducts battles in kind of a sneaky and subtle way.
A Game of Thrones, Catelyn 6. "What madness is this?" he said bluntly. Brynden Tully had never been a man to blunt the edge of his words. "A night ascent with the moon not even full? Even Lysa should know that's an invitation to a broken neck."
Note there that the Knight of the Gate is calling the Lady of the Eyrie by her first name while directly insulting her by saying, even Lysa should know, in front of a few of her subjects. That's not normally how, knights speak about their, superiors, but here he is just saying what's on his mind. Selmy would not talk like this. Let's not forget how he also tears into Edmure after the Battle of Stone Mill. He's, again, the reverse of Selmy here. Sneaky on the battlefield, but extremely straightforward with his words. He's described as blunt more than once, and really, you don't need to have seen that description because the way he talks just points that out directly. So again, figuratively, Black Knight kind of means evil, but it doesn't apply here. It's the literal sense in which Brynden is a Black Knight, meaning he's a knight of shadows and darkness who makes expert use of surprise and secrecy. So it's just the first time we see him in action. His leadership is crucial to the ambush, which is called a battle of the in the Whispering Woods, which takes place at night. Given his great expertise in these forms of warfare, perhaps that's the aptitude he showed at an early age. Not just fighting, but sneaking around in the battlefield and ambushing and things like that, having a talent for that sort of thing. But there weren't any major wars that we know of around the time he was knighted, so it had to be something, but it wasn't, actual combat experience in a major war, again, that we know of. Regardless of how he earned his early minor fame, we do know how he became known throughout the realm, and it didn't take much longer than this.
Family, fame, name.
In that order? No, not in that order. First the fame, then the family, then the name. In the year 260, when Brynden was somewhere between 18 to 21, one last attempt to take the throne from the Targaryens was made by a Blackfyre claimant. It was the
War of the Ninepenny Kings.
And around the time of this knighting was also the tragedy of Summerhall, which led to the crowning of Jaehaerys II. And we all know what comes next. The War of Ninepenny Kings is responsible for so much of the relationships we see on page. As we've noted many times over, it was really like a wartime boys club that stretched over the next 4 decades. So many important meetings happened here that lasted a lifetime. Like Barristan Selmy, like the fate of House Baelish, and like the twisted friendship of Tywin Lannister and Aerys Targaryen, Brynden was fully formed in the war. His exploits are said to have earned him fame across the Seven Kingdoms, and it's not redundant to say that only Barristan earned more from the fighting in terms of renown. Despite being knighted at a young age, Brynden was likely an afterthought to most in the war at first, because he was just a second son that most people hadn't heard of. Sure, he'd been knighted early, but we're talking thousands and thousands and thousands of Westerosi, commanded by veterans from other regions. I mean, there's guys, again, Tywin Lannister, heir to the West, Hoster Tully, his brother, heir to the Riverlands, Ormond Baratheon, Hand to the King, and Lord of Storm's End, Steffon Baratheon, his heir, and by War's End, its lord, because Ormond was killed by none other than Maelys the Monstrous himself. Gerald Hightower, Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, was there, and he took over command after Ormond's death as well. Brynden was way down the pecking order, but by the end, his name was on the lips of many, so we can safely say he accomplished some pretty impressive feats. And one day, maybe in Fire and Blood, or maybe A Song of Ice and Fire, we'll learn what some of those feats were. It wouldn't be command, probably, because he was so young then, and there were so many veterans with higher standing. But the war was fought on the Stepstones and was said to be bloody. The Stepstones would not be a place where you would have typical pitched battles. There's probably a lot of back and forth and ambushing and surprise attacks. There's not a lot of castles there. So Blackfish might have been right at home, and this may have explained why he made such a name for himself. Now to take a step back from a meta perspective, an interesting thing about Blackfish is that most of what we know of him is through Catelyn's point of view, until Jaime comes along, and by then Cat doesn't have a point of view anymore, and so we see him through mostly Jaime's eyes. To Cat, he's a beloved, protective uncle, whom she has fond memories of from her earliest of early memories. To Jaime, he's a hero. Use that term living legend again, that would apply here. And also, he was an idol.
A Feast for Crows, Jaime 5. But at that age, no girl interested Jaime half so much as Hoster's famous brother, who had won renown fighting the Ninepenny Kings upon the Stepstones. At table he had ignored poor Lysa, whilst pressing Brynden Tully for tales of Maelys the Monstrous and the Ebon Prince.
Now, I feel you, Jaime. We would like to press him for those tales, too. Some other time, perhaps.
Lord Hoster, matchmaker.
In 264 AC, or a little later, Hoster and Bryndon's father passed, and Hoster inherited Riverrun, joining that new wave of Ninepenny veteran blood coming into power, as we just discussed. Brynden himself was, for a time, Hoster's heir, but he was never heir to Riverrun because Catelyn was born before their father died. You know, a little dynastic confusion there. But it doesn't even really matter because Brynden probably didn't care. He doesn't seem like the type to want to rule. You know, like Ned Stark always thought it was all meant for his brother and didn't really ever want to be Lord. Brynden kind of seems like he's cut from the same cloth. And he actually got his wish. He didn't have to rule Riverrun at any point. Despite not wanting to be heir, it didn't sever his ties with the political landscape, right? And politics has a way of involving you even when you don't want to be involved. And now Hoster, who's perhaps giddy with all the new friends he'd made at this Ninepenny Kings social, he had strong ideas, though. He was very involved in politics, and he seemed to be pretty good at it. He had these marriages that he planned, and unlike a lot of typical High Lords, his marriages went outside of their region. Well, some of them, anyway. He even found an incredibly good match for Brynden, Bethany Redwine of the Reach. And as we know, the Redwines certainly weren't a family to be sniffed at, and they certainly aren't now. They have the largest navy in Westeros right now. Well, maybe not for long, thanks to Euron, but that's still a big deal, right? They ruled the Arbor, still do. Well, again, Euron has something to say about that. But they're a huge family, rich and powerful. And given that the region is next door to the Riverlands, the Reach meaning, not the Arbor specifically, but the fact that they also border the Westerlands, again, the Riverlands, this is a great way to kind of tie things together. And remember, the Westerlands had just suffered through the Rain Tarbeck rebellion. And again, Tywin Lannister was on the rise right about then. In addition, there's a little bit more to it. The Redwines were among the three houses, along with the Tullys and the Tyrells, who lost out on their Targaryen marriages, under the kingship of Egg and his wife Beth of Blackwood. So it's interesting that these two jilted families would try to form a marriage alliance. Maybe it's related to that. I mean, this is still a generation later, but this could definitely be connected, But there would be no Redwine Tully marriage, no Bethany Blackfish. He refused it, and he kept refusing after that. And Hoster just won't let it go afterwards, and it becomes a part of him. People outside of their family talk about it. The Lannisters are talking about it. Some of the people that are with Jaime at the Siege of Riverrun bring it up, like, oh, he's so stubborn. Even his own brother couldn't move him to the marriage bed. It's just something that is associated with him constantly. And it's the beginning as well of the fracturing, right? When they were young, Hoster and Brynden were close. But this was a major beginning of a dispute that would never be truly resolved. Hoster was all about the good of the family, the politics, the duty, as he saw it. Right? We're not saying that Hoster was in the wrong, but we are saying that Brynden and Hoster saw things differently. One of the largest conversations about Brynden Tully is why he turned down the marriage. It comes up at the Siege of Riverrun again, and it comes up in a lot of places. It's basically just associated with stubbornness, though. That's what people call it, but it might be more than that. Let's make some guesses, because we don't actually know. George R. Martin himself said that he won't expand on this reasoning at all. We're left to our own devices. George will not give any clues on it. He's been asked point blank, and he maintains his air of mystery, which might mean it's relevant to something later, or it might mean George just hasn't fully fleshed it out himself yet. Either way, I hope we find out one day. It's probably not something shallow, though, like just he wasn't attracted to her, because Hoster arranged several marriage proposals, and what, are we supposed to think that he's just that picky? I don't know, it doesn't seem like him. And it's also, could be that he's gay, but, there's plenty of examples of gay people in Westeros getting married and having families while, just playing along, or whatever you want to call it. Plenty of examples of gay men fathering children, both in the real world and in Westeros, so this isn't enough to go on either. It's certainly possible, though. But there's really no actual evidence for it. Just the fact that he never married isn't enough to declare something like that. It just remains a possibility. But perhaps Brynden didn't want to see the Tullys so embroiled with these other houses, right? His brother was making unusual marriages outside of the region. And maybe Brynden was against that. Again, though, that maybe doesn't work either because he spurned a Bracken marriage and a Frey marriage, too. And those are both Riverlands marriages. So any combination of these are possible, but there's no singular piece of evidence that he's just stubborn or that he's gay or that he's both or that he's against these alliances. These are all just possibilities. He kept it to himself, just like George R. R. Martin. Maybe Blackfish is taking a page from the man himself. It may well be that he had some other love that he refused to spurn. Hey, like Barristan himself, the man we're constantly comparing him to, who had a thing for Ashara Dane. But again, total guess. Faint possibility, no evidence, just ideas. The only real direction we get from the text could be interpreted many ways too. And this is Catelyn, who is very confident that Brynden would never marry.
A Game of Thrones, Catelyn 11.
Even on his deathbed.
Catelyn thought, sadly.
He has not wed, you know that, father, nor will he ever.
So yeah, we just don't know. Martin hasn't given us a lot of clues, and we may never learn. It may be one of those things that George decides to leave open-ended. There's also one last possibility, which is that he's just stubborn. He doesn't like to be told what to do. He's proud. He does things his own way. And he just doesn't want to have matchmaking done for him. Maybe it's just a decades-long case of digging his heels in. I mean, but don't forget what a big deal it is. Refusing your liege lord is really rare. And it might just be because Brynden is so much a factor on his own, because he's so famous on his own, and it's why he can get away with it, you know? Someone of lesser standing might have just had to go along with it. Regardless, he refused, and it was left that way. And the argument resulting in more arguments drove a wedge between them. As the years went on, this bitterness only grew. It's likely that this didn't help calm Hoster that Bethany Redwine went on to marry Mathis Rowan, a prominent lord of the Reach, gave him 3 children. You can imagine Hoster seething over the years, watching his prize catch solidify another house. An interesting side note is that one of Bethany Redwine's children was the accuser of Darion of the Night's Watch. Random connection there. Darion obviously went on to accompany Sam, Gilly, and Maester Aemon on their way to Old Town, and in Braavos, he, abandoned them to go drink and be with prostitutes. So Sam, Gilly, and Maester Aemon can all squarely place this problem at Brynden's feet. Just kidding. It might be worth noting that Hoster was at least potentially right about producing offspring. The Tullys did end up needing help later on, but I don't really see it that way. It's worth throwing out there. But if Brynden had his own children, then they might have helped out during the war. But I think that's a little much. But there would be more heirs as opposed to just Edmure. Right now, Edmure is the heir, and he's in captivity, and that complicates things. If he had married, who knows what he would be? He'd never be the man he is now. He wouldn't have his reputation. He probably wouldn't have his famous customized Tully sigil either.
The obsidian trout.
A Game of Thrones, Catelyn 6. During one of their louder quarrels, when Catelyn was 8, Lord Hoster had called Brynden the black goat of the Tully flock. Laughing, Brynden had pointed out that the sigil of their house was a leaping trout, so he ought to be a black fish rather than a black goat, and from that day forward he had taken it as his personal emblem.
Despite his fame and how frequently nicknames in Westeros are born of deeds in combat, Brynden took the name of Blackfish not from something amazing he did in war, but from an argument with his brother when he was around 30, long after the Ninepenny Kings. With regards to Selmy, there's another big difference between the two of them. Barristan got his nickname at age 10, so advantage Selmy there. But anyway, the fact that Brynden seems to have derived some humor, he was kind of laughing about this argument while annoying his brother, maybe that just supports the theory that that's just who he is. He doesn't like to be bossed around, and that's it. Simple as that. And when Brynden eventually returns to Riverrun with Catelyn in A Game of Thrones, one of the first thing Hoster says. Now, to be fair, Hoster's, in his, not in his right mind. He's very sick, and he's on painkillers, milk with the poppy and all. He's still, first thing he says is, Bethany Redwine. He starts complaining about that. And Catelyn relays that to Brynden, and Brynden just laughs. He just thinks, of course he brought that up. Now, it may just be coincidence. It's probably just coincidence. But the actual first mention of obsidian or dragonglass, which is its nickname, of course, is Blackfish's, black fish. It's blue and red for House Tully, and his cloak is that color, but the black fish pins it to him. It's to his shoulders. And if it's not a coincidence, then join me in getting excited about him as a commander in the War for the Dawn. You know, something about that symbology of an obsidian fish. There's quite a lot that would have to happen before that, though. We're a ways from him interacting with the armies of the dead and the White Walkers and all that. And he's a family-first guy. That's his priority. Let's not forget that. So his changed emblem, let's talk about that for a second. The Tullys are an ancient house and have been ruling the Riverlands for 300 years and have had Riverrun for like 1,000. Everyone in the Seven Kingdoms would know that their sigil is the trout and the blue and red. They all are familiar with that. It's a famous pairing. So that sigil is mentioned multiple times throughout the text, especially in Riverrun. The guards wear fish crest helms. Hoster's bedposts look like leaping trout. It's everywhere, you know? Just like the other great houses, the Tullys, you know, well, they've had this, who knows which Lord Tully had that bed made. Over the years, there's been plenty of pride and some vanity mixed in. All these great houses, their sigil is a big deal. You know, Illyria likes to make fun of that, but it is what it is. Brynden himself separated from this a bit and made it his own, right? Maybe this annoyed Hoster, maybe he didn't care, but maybe because it was in reference to their argument, I'm gonna lean towards it annoying him a little bit. And it's not a good look when your vassal and your brother has decided to distinguish himself from his own line. I don't know how big a deal that was, but he certainly got away with it. We can also guess that Brynden himself didn't care what other people thought of it, including his brother. He liked to have that level of individuality, and the Blackfish sigil kind of gave him that. And it fits him perfectly, right? He's devoted to family. It's still a trout, but he does it in his own way, as the colors indicate, or lack of color indicates in this case. It's another parallel to his namesake, by the way. Bloodraven had a dragon on his personal crest to show his allegiance to House Targaryen, but it was a pale white dragon in color with red eyes like him. Very personalized. So Brynden Tully doing the same thing as well, making the sigil his color. But despite both these guys being like maverick types, they were both heavily relied upon because they were so good at what they did or do. Unlike Bloodraven, though, Blackfish was actually very popular with his older brother's children.
Uncle Brynden.
Despite his failed findings for Brynden, Hoster secured himself a wife in Minissa Went. There's no specific date on their marriage, but we can assume it was likely around 260 to 262, as Catelyn was Minissa's third pregnancy. So when 264, 265, when Catelyn was born, that's also when Brynden lost his heir status that he probably didn't care about. The relationship between Catelyn and Brynden is an important one, but we'll get to that later because she's still just a little baby at this point. Hoster and Minissa would also have more kids to follow. Circa 266, 268, Catelyn was joined by Lysa, and around 270, Edmure arrived, and he became the heir. So the Tullys played at happy family for several years. Everything was good for a while, but then Minissa's death happened. Unfortunately, the then is hard to pinpoint. It's like a 10-year range on it, but I'm guessing it's more towards the beginning of that. Somewhere between 268 and 78, but probably towards 68. And that's because Kat doesn't remember her very well. So you got to figure she was more on the young side. It would be interesting to know how well Minissa and Brynden got along, but given how well he got along with pretty much the whole family other than his brother, it was probably very painful for him, especially because he got along with the kids, and it would be painful for them, so he would share in their grief. It was certainly painful for Hoster. A lot of marriages are political in Westeros, but sometimes they work out, and there's love in these marriages despite them being political, and this is definitely one of those times.
A Clash of Kings, Catelyn 1.
He talks of his regrets, of unfinished tasks, of people long dead and times long past. Sometimes he does not know what season it is, or who I am. Once he called me by mother's name.
He misses her still, Sir Brynden answered.
It's a fair guess that her death put a strain on Hoster and Brendan's relationship because, she didn't have, that balance wasn't there anymore. That love wasn't in his life anymore. Kind of like how Tywin went from, what he was to what he is now, just a more severe version of himself when Joanna died. I think it's probably fairly similar. It's a great counterexample, or similar example, rather. And despite this brotherly arguing, Hoster's 3 children had a pretty happy childhood, right? This is the only conflict that we know of. Everybody else seemed to get along really well. The Blackfish played uncle. He was probably pretty happy to do this. And Catelyn remembers very fondly these childhood memories relating to him.
The Game of Thrones, Catelyn 6.
Nonetheless, during all those years of Catelyn's girlhood, it had been Brynden the Blackfish to whom Lord Hoster's children had run with their tears and their tales, when father was too busy and mother too ill. Catelyn, Lysa, Edmure, and yes, even Peter Baelish, their father's ward. He had listened to them all patiently, as he listened now, laughing at their triumphs and sympathizing with their childish misfortunes.
The Cat's memories show an interesting side to Brendan's character, too. Up to this point, you would be forgiven for thinking Brynden a quiet, reserved man, more in love with his sword than anyone else and quite emotionally distant. But don't forget how blunt he is with his words. He doesn't mince, he says what's on his mind. And as we know, George R. R. Martin, too, he likes to be more complicated than that. He doesn't like to make things too simple when there's depth to be explored within a character. And Brendan's too important to be relegated to two-dimensional character status. He very obviously cared for the children, especially Catelyn. And maybe you could say that while Hoster had the weight of the realm and running the family, Brynden was kind of the cool uncle who was able to take joy in the little things, such as being with his family, just hanging out with them day to day and enjoying life that way. He seemed to care for them more than his simple duty as an uncle. Again, family is the first word for House Tully. And it's kind of cool, though, to think about how, despite being a renowned warrior and just a badass all around, he could hang out with his family, laugh and play games, and listen. He was said to be a very good listener by Catelyn. At some point in their childhoods, these 3 young Tullys, Lysa, Catelyn, and Edmure, the War of Ninepenny Kings became important again, even though it had happened in the past. Because during the fighting, Hoster befriended Lord Baelish, the father of Peter. And of course, because of that friendship, Hoster agreed to foster, hey, nice rhyme there, a young son. And that's him, Peter. So he lived there, and he got along with Blackfish too. Blackfish apparently was like a second uncle-ish type thing. So he did have warmth for outside his family, even though he generally focused on just them. So as those 3 grew, so did Peter along with them, and he became enamored with the girls, especially Catelyn, as we well know. And it was reached the point that it was, he got so serious about it and so in his head about it that when it was announced that she was going to be betrothed to Brynden, or that she was betrothed to Brynden, it was official. Littlefinger tried to kiss her that same night, and of course, she rejected him. So he went and got drunk and passed out. But Blackfish is the one who carried him to bed, maybe saving him from some embarrassment, showing that tender side again. Although, maybe it would have been better if he didn't, because this is the night that Lysa came to his room after he was drunk, but before he passed out, slept with him. She got pregnant, and that didn't go well. So, since we know that Blackfish was the one they ran to, kind of the cool uncle they could talk to, imagine Lysa going to talk to him about this, running to him and be like, hey, I'm pregnant, blah, blah, blah. So he probably knew about Hoster giving her Tansy to abort it, right? Abort the baby. So that couldn't have helped his relationship with Hoster. Remember that this incident nearly killed her. And he, already having disputes with his brother and loving his nieces and nephew, how could this have not bothered him a lot? Soon enough, the tournament of Harrenhal came around. It was held by a relative of Lady Minissa, because she's from House Went. And that's who ruled the Harrenhal until early in the series. About the time of Feast for Crows, the Wents are pretty much done. So it seems likely the Tullys were there because that's their family. That's their family by marriage, and all the, Catelyn's half Tully, or rather half Went. So as a side note, we don't really hear of Blackfish taking interest in tourneys. Again, the opposite of Selmy. Selmy was a famous tourney knight. Blackfish, we don't hear about him competing in a single tournament. To go deeper, given that Catelyn was about to be married, Blackfish was also surely around when Brandon Stark ran off to the Red Keep in his famous furious rage, demanding that Rhaegar come out to die because he believed that Lyanna was kidnapped. What did Brynden think of that? Of Brandon marrying Cat in general? Of Lyanna and Rhaegar? What did he think of that? I wonder if he offered to help track them down or something. Or I wonder if he didn't do anything and maybe felt guilty later, as others surely did, that he hadn't tried to intervene. Or not. I mean, it wasn't his fault. It wasn't his duty. But sometimes honorable men and women, they think I could have done more. They take the responsibility on themselves. And this kind of seems like the kind of guy Brynden is. Whatever he thought or felt about it, though, it marked the end of what was possibly the best time of his life. Maybe not counting his childhood, perhaps. It was the end of spending day in and day out with family and relative peace, and war was what came instead.
Robert's Rebellion.
As the mention of Brandon, Lyanna, and Rhaegar might have hinted to you, the War of the Usurper, right around the corner. Had House Tully chosen a different side, if they had kept with their traditional Targaryen loyalties, well, War of the Usurper is probably what it would be called today instead of Robert's Rebellion, because again, the victors get to decide these things. This is a major decision for Hoster, though. It would have had to be difficult. The Tullys, again, long history of siding with the Targaryens, but look at the recent history. Look at Aerys and look at Celia Tully's rejection. Things weren't so good as they had been. And the Riverlands, being the Riverlands, is always in a tough spot when it comes to war, because they're in the middle, right? They have the most shared borders with other regions, and they don't have a lot of natural defenses outside of the rivers. There's not a lot of deep forests or big mountains or anything like that. So I kind of imagine, this is a headcanon moment here, that Brynden himself was part of these councils, and he would focus and think about a lot the various strengths and weaknesses of their neighbors. You know, kind of calculating it all, decide, well, who do we have the best chance against? Well, meanwhile, Hoster focuses on the politics, the appearances, the alliances, and the marriages. It seemed like they were a good team when they worked together because they had complementary skills. But again, these difficulties between them on the personal level may have, well, it probably didn't help in spots like this. Remember Jaehaerys Targaryen spurning Celia Tully to marry his own sister in secret? Hoster, again, was born just after that. Brynden 5 years later. The two of these guys grew up hearing about that. So again, it comes up and it's huge. Let's think of it this way. Take the pride that's so common with these noble families. Had Jaehaerys married Celia, the Tullys of then would be living under a Tully queen now. Or under her descendants. Half Tully princes and princesses running around. They got Aerys and Rhaella instead. Can you imagine the bitterness is like, this is what we get? Our house could have been the royal family, and we get this instead. You could easily see them just shaking their heads like, what? Every time Aerys does something crazy, they'd just be like, this wouldn't have happened if that was a Tully queen, right? What an embarrassment. Imagine Dante from Clerk saying, I shouldn't even be here today. It's the same kind of, yeah. They wouldn't be having to choose sides in this war, for one thing. They would know who to side with. Their family. That would be an easy choice. So even though Hoster put family first, probably, as much as we can tell, it might have been satisfying to turn against a king and a queen who wouldn't even exist had his family not been jilted. And it's not like the Targaryens were going to offer the satisfaction of any marriages this time either. While the Starks and the Arryns, well, that is exactly what they were offering. Robb Stark and Jon Arryn were going to marry Tullys. What the Targaryens offered what? The chance to do your duty to a king that's terrible, who burns people alive, who's broken the feudal contract many times. What's more satisfying than that, though, is picking the winner. They, maybe the Tullys, if they had been on the other side, it would have pushed the war that way. But had the Tullys been on the losing side, on Robert's side, they would have been amongst the most punished, I think, other than the Baratheons. And as wars, especially civil wars, tend to tear apart the realm, it has a trickle-down effect and tears things down on a smaller scale. Regions, families are torn apart even when they fight for the same side.
The Riverlands divided.
It's not like Hoster had a choice that wasn't war, and eventually he did choose rebellion, as we know. Even though the Brynden-Catelyn marriage was off, because Brynden was dead, he presumably still felt the same way about who his friends were and where his long-term interests lie. So Ned had agreed to take his brother's place, but the marriage didn't actually come right away, nor did the marriage to Lysa, nor even the idea. Because at the time, well, Jon Arryn had a living heir. First, there was a lot of fighting in the Riverlands, subjugating those who chose Targaryen over Tully. Then came the key battle of Stony Sept, that which convinced Aerys that this rebellion was a real threat. And Stony Sept is in the Riverlands again. Remember earlier I mentioned how everything happens in the Riverlands? Well, the final battle also happened in the Riverlands, the Battle of the Trident, right? Curiously, though, we don't really know what Brynden did during any of this. It's obvious that he participated in some form or fashion. We just don't know exactly how or why. There's no mention of what Hoster commanded him to do, what battles he fought in, not even if he was at the Trident later on, which is pretty curious in and of itself. And we get a pretty thorough list throughout the series of who was there, but no one mentions the Blackfish. So we have a few options. We know that Hoster himself fought in the Battle of the Bells. And we have this example of one of the only mentions of the event. Arya overhears this whilst in the company of the Brotherhood Without Banners between Notch and Gendry.
A storm of swords, Arya 8. Who did it then? Asked Gendry. Hoster Tully. Notch was a stooped, thin, gray-haired man born in these parts. This was Lord Goodbrook's village. When Riverrun declared for Robert, Goodbrook stayed loyal to the king, so Lord Tully came down on him with fire and sword. After the Trident, Goodbrook's son made his peace with Robert and Lord Hoster, but that didn't help the dead none.
So Notch seems pretty certain that it was Hoster himself, but that doesn't exclude Brynden's involvement. We really don't have enough info at this point. It seems Hoster was fairly pragmatic and willing to do what needed to be done. We already know he wanted the village burnt, so really it's a question of whether he'd want to do it himself. Would Brynden disobey an order like this? Maybe. I mean, we've seen him disobey other things, especially marriage, and, this is burning villagers. That's a bit harsher. Then again, this is war, and Brynden understands that well, and he may have understood why this horrible command had to be issued. And he himself, in A Dance with Dragons, ejected useless mouths from Riverrun while scouring the land around it of food, probably dooming them all, especially with winter coming on top of it. So he did similar here, I guess. Edmure is the Tully who seems to care about the commoners in this way, not Brynden. But his own personal loyalties may have come up as well. Recall that Brynden squired for Lord Derry, and the Derrys are staunch Targaryen loyalists. That may have really torn him apart on the inside a bit if he had to fight against any of them. It may be also why he didn't want those entangling marriages early. It may relate to that. And let's not sleep on old Norbert Vance, who squired with Brynden. We don't know what side the Vances were on during the rebellion, but maybe that they were on the Targaryen side, and that made it even harder for Brynden. It's also important that House Lannister hadn't taken a side yet, and they remained in the west, really near Riverrun, with that army just poised to strike, so Hoster had to worry about that. Obviously, Tywin had been handed the king for Aerys, so he could easily see how they might take the Targaryen side. So maybe Brynden was held back in order to stay and guard against an attack from the west. If Tywin's going to come for you, you want the Blackfish there dealing with him. You want your best man in position for that. And he seems to be an expert in defense as much as he is on offense, so it would fit that well as much too. Handling Tywin, certainly tougher than handling those good brick villages, right? But whatever the arrangement, Hoster felt he could rely on Blackfish despite their disagreements. But the outlook was different for Brynden himself.
House Tully divided.
After the Battle of the Bells, it was time to make things official. Jon Arryn's heir had died during that battle, killed by Jon Connington himself. So the North Riverlands Vale Baratheon alliance sealed this deal with a double marriage. The original marriage to Catelyn and Ned, instead of Brynden and Catelyn, and of course Lysa and Jon Arryn. Now, the Lysa-Jon Arryn part was kind of rushed and announced kind of late in the game, so it was a very different situation personally for Lysa as it was for Catelyn. And Lysa has to marry someone, 40 years older than her, whereas Catelyn got to marry Ned Stark, who's about her age. And this is also the time when Robert announced his claim to the throne, presumably after discussing it with these other great lords who were present. They all kind of agreed that his claim was the best, his leadership was vital, and Blackfish was probably there for all that. He was probably part of these chats. You wouldn't leave the famous Blackfish out of these important conversations, I wouldn't think. A big swing for the realm and all these families, right? This is a huge turning point. And Bryndon's life took a big swing on that day, too. Right after the ceremony, he informed Hoster that he would be leaving his beloved home to accompany Lysa at the Eyrie. Hoster immediately disowned Brynden and didn't say his name again till A Game of Thrones when he's on his deathbed. I don't think there's a clearer piece of evidence that Hoster loved his brother and relied on him. Again, they were close as boys. He took this personally, it seems like. From Hoster's point of view, not a point of view chapter, but from his perspective, his famous brother, here he is leaving right when the war is getting serious, and he's so vital. He's such a valuable asset. Right after House Tully has sealed its future with this final commitment via double marriage. I mean, has there ever been a double marriage of two daughters to two different great houses in one ceremony? I didn't actually research that particular thing, but I don't think so. I really don't think so. Either way, it's quite a time to announce that you're leaving, right? So remember, aside from when abroad for the war, Riverrun had always been home for Brynden, and he seemingly adored the castle and his family. But, I mean, from his perspective, these marriages and alliances meant the family was breaking apart anyway. For now, they'd remain at Riverrun, but after the war, Catelyn would be heading north, and Lysa would go east. Only Hoster and Edmure would remain, and they had each other. Plus, it certainly seems Brynden was more fond of the girls. The Tansy incident could weigh here heavily, too. If he knew about it, which he probably did, as we said earlier, it's really hard to imagine Blackfish, a guy who doesn't really play politics, being okay with his brother tricking his niece into having an abortion because of politics. Right? There's no way he would be cool with that. Whether tensions had been particularly high with Hoster around this time, well, we don't know. You know, they were always arguing, but it seems like this would have made it worse. All the things happening. But any or all these guesses could be close to the mark. We don't have to assume it's just one thing. There's a lot of things that could be involved here. So again, we consider the type of man he was. And at heart, he's a soldier, a protector. Did he look at his two still young nieces in the time of war and decide he would go with the obviously weaker one in the aim of protecting her? Was it like his protective instinct kicking in? I mean, all we know of Lysa and of Brynden kind of fits, doesn't it? Also, he may have been impressed with Jon Arryn. Jon Arryn's the one who called the banners and rejected the call for the heads of his wards. That is how someone should behave, I would think, from Blackfish's point of view. He'd say, hey, that's a man standing up for people that he treats as family that aren't actually family. Regardless of his reasoning, Jon Arryn was probably pretty happy to get the great Blackfish on his immediate side. I mean, they were already on the same side, but, in his employ. And we're told Blackfish gained more renown during the war, but again, no specifics. The Battle of the Trident itself is the next major battle, and it's also pretty detail-light, despite being so famous. So there's a chance we learn more later. I hope so. But I definitely figure that Blackfish was leading outriders and fighting in skirmishes ahead of the main battle, and then fighting in that too, kind of like what he does in the War of Five Kings. Either way, the war took a while longer to officially end, but it was certainly over. One wonders if he returned to the Riverlands at all before taking on his new duties as a peacetime resident of the Vale, but it seems unlikely because of, again, the difficulties with his brother.
The Fish and the Falcon.
Lysa lost her pregnancy during the war, and it broke her heart because Kat thinks that it's partly because she didn't lose hers. Lysa couldn't bear to hold Robb. She started crying the first time she was handed him and never held him again. So if Bryndon's protective nature factored in before, it may have kicked into an even higher gear now. However, he may not have known a lot of this because he was away for the war. It's not exactly his kind of battle. He's a soldier, not the kind of guy that maybe is the best at handling emotional issues. Although we are told he's a good listener, which just by itself counts for a lot. But it's a soldier's job he was given.
The Knight of the Gate.
At some point, probably not that long ago, given a comment by Ned who said that, I heard he'd been made Knight of the Gate, which you wouldn't think that would have happened so long ago. Jon Arryn bestows him this title, which is a very high regarded title. It's the Bloody Gate is the gate that it refers to, and this guards the entrance to the Vale itself. How nice that the Vale, this vast region, has this nice tight entrance that it's really hard to go elsewhere unless you're coming in by ship. So you can see why it's placed with such high esteem, and Lysa might have felt more comfortable with him being there, especially, knowing how protective he was at a younger age. And if you've watched the TV show or read Catelyn's description, you can conjure up a pretty good image of the Bloody Gate and why it's just so difficult and so imposing to an invading army.
A Game of Thrones, Catelyn 6. She was about to say as much when she saw the battlements ahead, long parapets built into the very stone of the mountains on either side of them, where the pass shrank to a narrow defile scarce wide enough for 4 men to ride abreast. Twin watchtowers clung to the rocky slopes, joined by a covered bridge of weathered gray stone that arched above the road. Silent faces watched from arrow slits in tower, battlements, and bridge. When they had climbed almost to the top, a knight rode out to meet them. His horse and his armor were gray, but his cloak was the rippling blue and red of Riverrun, and a shiny black fish, wrought in gold and obsidian, pinned its folds against his shoulder. "Who would pass the Bloody Gate?" he called.
As you can imagine, and as we know from history, well, probably no one even tried to attack the Bloody Gate while Brynden was there. As far as we know, there's no evidence that happened, and it would be crazy to do that, so it's a safe guess that it didn't happen. But we do know that Brynden held the position until Catelyn's arrival with Tyrion around 298. And he was, somewhere around the Vale all that time, either as the Knight of the Gate or, with Jon Arryn or somewhere else with Lysa for about 16 years. And most of that was peaceful. But he still remained estranged from his family that whole time, apart from Lysa. But she was getting worse every year. Her psyche was eroding. Her paranoia was getting worse. And while he himself is, very steadfast in his duties, he probably kept his skills maintained, but we don't really know what happened during the rest of Westeros either during the 16 years. So, it's just a big kind of empty space there. But it was probably mostly peaceful, except for about 6 years after he arrived, war broke out again, thanks to Balon Greyjoy's first rebellion. But the Vale was really far from the Iron Islands. I'm not sure that they got involved much. Brynden may have wanted to be involved, but we don't know that he was. And he was around 50, so maybe he didn't actually want to be that involved. And also of note, during this long stint, where he was about 9 years into his time at the Eyrie at this point, where the Greyjoy Rebellion, Lysa gave birth to a young Robert Arryn. So he's, the new heir to the Vale. And just 4 years after that, that's when Hoster started getting really, really ill, which is where the book begins. Book 1 starts with this as the status quo. Now, unlike the TV show, Brynden doesn't show up till like season 3. Blackfish is involved really early on in the books and right away in terms of Robb's campaign. And this starts with a decision to switch nieces. While the Tullys all over are making mistakes or being crazy or becoming undead, Blackfish stands tall and persistent and consistent.
Thanks to the history of Westeros blood riders, Koholkoi, master of the bow called Sunpiercer, slayer of all the pumpkin spice vendors in Westeros, and Vorsaki, wielder of a Valyrian steel arak with a dragon bone hilt. And our sellsword captains, Peter Blaze of the Emerald Isle, captain of the Werewood Wanderers, to long lives, quick deaths, cold beer, and warm women. Daegron, marshal of the Axe, captain of the Red Tide, resistance is futile. Kyron Callsbane, captain of the Stone Shields, the torrent breaks upon the stone. Haema Helminth, captain of the Whispering Children, dead men tell no secrets. Lady Lazara Dajo, the Iron Lily, master archer, castellan of the Summer Allen Keep Arboreal Point, captain of the all-female Wailing Widows. Women and children first. Cody the Crimson, bastard of Bracken, captain of the Red Waste Exiles and recruiter of the Free Folk. Cameron the Hammer of Hornwood, captain of the English Lions, with the motto, "Honor is the reward of virtue." Also, a reminder to visit historyofwesteros.com from time to time, especially if you plan on shopping at Amazon. We've got a lot of links to a lot of cool products there that are Game of Thrones related, and anything you buy through those links tracks back to us and we get a little bit of credit, so you'd be supporting the show by shopping there.
A Song of Ice and Fire and Blackfish.
In A Game of Thrones, Catelyn makes her infamous decision to take Tyrion at the Inn of the Kneeling Man and then secretly take him to the Eyrie so as to avoid trouble on the way back to Winterfell, and to seek support from Lysa and the Vale in the possible upcoming confrontations with the Lannisters. Catelyn and company did still find trouble on the road, running into the mountain clans and eventually being saved by a sortie led by Sir Donald Waynwood and taken to the Bloody Gate. Sir Donald, actually, interestingly enough, is the one who replaces Blackfish when he departs as Knight of the Gate. So when uncle and niece meet again, after so many years, Catelyn gives us our first description proper of Sir Brynden, and you can tell how happy she is to see him.
A Game of Thrones, Catelyn 6.
Take off your helm. I would look on your face again.
The years have not improved it, I fear,
Brynden Tully said, but when he lifted off the helm, Catelyn saw that he lied. His features were lined and weathered, and time had stolen the auburn from his hair and left him only gray. But the smile was the same, and the bushy eyebrows fat as caterpillars, and the laughter in his deep blue eyes.
Brynden gives something away when we first meet him. When Catelyn tells him all she knows about the Lannisters and Jon Arryn's death and everything else, his immediate response reads,
A Game of Thrones, Catelyn 6.
Your father must be told, he said at last. If the Lannisters should march, Winterfell is remote and the Vale walled up behind its mountains, but Riverrun lies right in their path.
Brendan's first thought is of family and his ancestral home. Even with the animosity between them, Brynden puts his brother first. We also don't really have to spend too long to learn that the Blackfish is quite vexed with his niece and how she's descending into paranoia and not protecting her family. You know, that's probably the biggest thing for him.
A Game of Thrones, Catelyn 7. At the doors to Lysa's apartments, they met her uncle storming out.
Going to join the Fool's Festival? Sir Brynden snapped. I'd tell you to slap some sense into your sister if I thought it would do any good, but you'd only bruise your hand.
He's just disgusted with Lysa's insistence on hiding, and especially with not helping. And he immediately agrees to go with Catelyn and help her son, Robb, who, again, is half Tully, and he had just declared war on the Iron Throne, so clearly he's going to need some help. And there's likely a multitude of factors that led Blackfish to make this decision, like annoyance with Lysa, maybe boredom, or just the fact that he knew Robb would need help, and he saw it as his duty. Probably all these things matter. But he also got to return to the Riverlands, which probably was a plus.
A Game of Thrones, Catelyn 7.
I asked your sister for leave to take 1,000 seasoned men and ride for Riverrun with all haste. Do you know what she told me? The Vale cannot spare 1,000 swords, nor even one, uncle, she said. You are the Knight of the Gate. Your place is here. Well, I told her she could bloody well find herself a new Knight of the Gate. Blackfish or no, I am still a Tully. I shall leave for Riverrun by evenfall.
That last line is perfect, right? It's their house words looming large. He declares that he's done with being a Knight of the Gate, a great honor that he's held a long time, deciding that his duty is to fight for the more imperiled side of his family. Lysa seems pretty safe. I seriously doubt the highly prestigious position of Knight of the Gate has seen a lot of voluntary defections like this, but, that's comparing him to the Kingsguard and Night's Watch, though, that this is kind of a cushy job, considering how ridiculous it would be to attack the Bloody Gate. Lots of reasons to think his niece Lysa and great-nephew Robert Arryn were safe, right? Littlefinger aside, but Robb was clearly in great danger, and Catelyn too, so it was time to go.
The young wolf's right-hand fish.
Lysa's paranoia and hostage disownment make it entirely possible that Brynden hadn't seen his birthplace during his tenure in the Vale, but to return, he would have to fight his way there. The route they took was not exactly direct, as you can see here on the screen, but it was safer. It didn't take long for Brynden to make his mark in yet another war. His reputation being what it was, almost immediately, Robb made the very smart decision to make the Blackfish the leader of his outriders, his eyes and ears. George does a fantastic job of showing the finer points of warfare through Brynden. We often think of a war hero, here we are again with this comparison again, like a Barristan, the bold type, cutting his way through an entire town to save his king, or through the Golden Company. And while Brynden is certainly capable of such fighting skill, it's his forethought and tactics that really help Robb's campaign. Firstly, he clashes with Adam Marbrand's outriders, managing to repel them, which allows Robb's forces to move down into the Riverlands. And Adam Marbrand is highly regarded. Even more importantly, Brynden is able to deal with the Lannister scouts and halting their communications by bringing down all the ravens. Referring back to the quote at the beginning of this episode. By doing this, he's able to hide the fact that Robb intends to split his forces. Without this simple help, Robb would have likely been finished before he started. One of Brendan's biggest marks on the War of the Five Kings is engineering the battle in the Whispering Wood. Remember the timing. Robb had just crossed into the Riverlands, but Jaime Lannister had already been making his mark, defeating Lords Piper and Vance in the Western Hills before moving on to Riverrun itself, winning a battle beneath its walls and then putting it under siege. So Jaime obviously scored first in the war. He's taken the heir of the region. Remember, Hoster is gravely ill by this point, so Edmure is pretty much running things. And he put a major castle in his control. It wasn't a great look for Robb's campaign, and it made Jaime look brilliant. But not for long. It's all downhill for Jaime from there. And Blackfish, who had long looked brilliant, reminded the realm that he was still a factor despite his age. Thanks in large part to Brynden, Jaime became a prisoner at Riverrun, only to come back later with an army, thanks to Blackfish, who had retaken Riverrun. It all comes in circles. While Jaime's mistakes were more egregious, more costly, Tywin himself also underestimated who he was up against. He couched his plans in the typical overconfidence and inexperience of youth, thinking too much of his own son's tendencies, perhaps. He should have been thinking of Blackfish. Tywin even pointed out how terrible the optics of sending Selmy away were, especially if he showed up alongside Renly or Robb Stark, but he didn't give the same weight to Blackfish. Selmy is certainly more traditionally popular, and in a war of legitimacy, popularity is powerful, but still, Blackfish on your side means a lot. Tywin and Jaime prepared for the king in the north, and they should have prepared for the Blackfish, but in their defense, he had been Knight of the Gate for so long, how were they to even know he had left the Vale? They didn't realize he was with Robb until it was too late. They didn't see him coming. That's Blackfish in a nutshell, isn't it? Being less popular than Selmy has its advantages after all. But we got to give Robb his due as well. He split his infantry and cavalry to prevent Tywin and Jaime linking up, something that could have made the war unwinnable for the north. And when our subject, possibly out of action for a very long time, proved he was amazing still, Robb was quick to maximize his talents and make good use of him. So that ruse was enough to fool Tywin at the Battle of the Green Fork and allow the more impressive plan to be enacted. But instead of just riding up and attacking Jaime's camp, the Northmen used Jaime's arrogance against him. Brynden himself made the call on Jaime's personality, getting a read on how to make use of his impatience and being confident in it. Robb agreed.
A Game of Thrones, Catelyn 10. The Kingslayer is restless and quick to anger,
her uncle Brynden had told Robb, and he had wagered their lives in their best hope of victory on the truth of what he said.
Brynden then showed his worth as he went ahead of Robb's main force, scouting the Lannisters and stopping the enemy from doing the same. If this part of the plan had failed, then the rest would have come crashing down with it. It was Blackfish's expertise that made it work. It was a difficult plan to pull off, and without the right people, they wouldn't have been able to do it. And the right people, in this case, is our man.
A Game of Thrones, Catelyn 10. Robb had given Blackfish 300 picked men and sent them ahead to screen his march.
Jaime does not know,
Sir Brynden said when he rode back.
I'll stake my life on that. No bird has reached him. My archers have seen to that. We've seen a few of his outriders, but those that saw us did not live to tell of it. He ought to have sent out more. He does not know.
Robb then sent out a small unit of men wearing Tully colors. Jaime, believing this to be a harrying force, rushed out head first right into the Whispering Wood. And who led the party that Jaime followed? Sir Brynden Tully. Now, we all know what happened next. The Northmen rushed from the trees, destroyed the Lannister force, and captured Jaime. It was a great victory, and all in King Robb's army knew that Blackfish was the chief architect of it all.
Return to Riverrun.
Brynden didn't have to wait long for glory to come again. With the Battle of the Camps, Robb moved to free Riverrun from its siege. As we all know, when Riverrun is in a pinch, the sluice gate is open, turning the castle into an island. This left 3 Lannister camps, north, west, and east, because they cannot sit together. Thanks to Brynden's earlier movements, the camps were all completely unaware of Robb's coming. Brynden was to strike first. He descended on the north camp out of nowhere, striking a huge victory and drawing the west camp over to help, only for Robb to then come in to finish the plan. The result was an overwhelming victory for the north, and no short thanks to Brynden. Back at Tywin's war camp, Tyrion hears a much better account of the battle than ours.
A Game of Thrones, Tyrion 9. The Blackfish led the van, cutting down our sentries and clearing away the palisades for the main assault. By the time our men knew what was happening, riders were pouring over the ditch banks and galloping through the camp with swords and torches in hand. I was sleeping in the west camp between the rivers. When we heard the fighting and saw the tents being fired, Lord Brax led us to the rafts and we tried to pole across. But the current pushed us downstream and the Tully started flinging rocks at us with the catapults at their walls. I saw 1 raft smashed to kindling and 3 others overturned. Men swept into the river and drowned.
And those who did make it back across found the Starks waiting for them on the riverbanks.
And just like that, the Blackfish is home again. Waiting for him was a quick break from war and his unfortunately dying brother. Catelyn goes to see Hoster in the midst of Riverrun celebrations, and they talk about Robb and the war. And then Brynden comes up in conversation, and despite the fact that he was so crucial in saving everyone from siege and helping Edmure, this old grievance returns immediately.
A Game of Thrones, Catelyn 11. Even so, spit on the girl. The red wines spit on me. His lord, his brother, that Blackfish. I had other offers. Lord Bracken's girl, Walder Frey, any of the three. He said, has he wed? Anyone.
Maybe this is a decent window into understanding why Brynden got so annoyed with his brother. It had been decades, and it was still the first thing out of Hoster's mouth. I mean, geez, right? It might get to somebody. I could see it getting to you. Get to me. Brynden, on the other hand, again, he laughed it off.
A Game of Thrones, Catelyn 11. Brynden Blackfish chuckled.
I am too old a soldier to believe that. Hoster will be chiding me about the red wine girl even as we light his funeral pyre. Damn his bones.
At one point, Catelyn walks into her father's solar to find Brynden sitting by the bed in his armor, a travel-stained cloak, and dusty boots, which I think shows us again how much Brynden wanted to be by his brother's side in these final days. His loyalty trumped their disagreements. It's rare of George to give us any strong family moments like this, but this reconciliation of Brynden and Hoster, super subtle, but really excellent, really touching. But nonetheless, there's still a war to be fought, and that had to take precedence. Brynden soon on the move again. Robb made the plan to go further west, leaving Edmure behind to protect Riverrun and hold off Tywin. Now, the details we have for this part of the war are a bit thinner, as we have no point of view for it. Catelyn was sent south to treat with Renly, while Theon was sent home to the Iron Islands, but we do catch up and learn what Robb and his great uncle got up to after the fact. Upon learning that a new Lannister host was being raised at Oxcross, Robb luckily had Grey Wind find a secret track through the Western Hills, which allowed them to use Brynden in much the same way as he did before, as a master outrider and scout killer, which he did exactly that, and soon enough, they were able to sneak up on this new host, which was completely unsuspecting, and destroy it before it could become useful to Tywin. This victory was perhaps even more impressive than the previous, because the host was gone, and Stafford Lannister was killed, and the Westerlands were now just wide open for Robb and Brynden to do their thing. This continued for a while, with much raiding and killing, until eventually Robb's forces had to return to Riverrun. While they were gone, Edmure had successfully defended Riverrun from Lannister forces, which was not what they wanted. They wanted him to get past. Edmure wasn't supposed to do that. He'd pushed them back too far. This is where one of the biggest contentions of Robb war strategy arises, and maybe some of the blame is on Blackfish. We're not sure. As we shortly find out after, Edmure managed to delay Tywin just long enough to hear that Stannis was about to attack King's Landing. And so Tywin was able to turn around, link up with the Tyrells, and stop Stannis rescuing King's Landing. And that was bad for the North and the Riverlands. That was their best chance to win the war. And unknowingly, Edmure messed it up. So this is possibly because of bad communication. But we bring this up because Brynden is on Robb's side in this. He berates Edmure. It's a point well recognized by more than a few essays and blogs that have been written in our community that Edmure did what pretty much anyone would do. He protected Riverrun, and then, believing he could gain his side advantage, went further. He was not told to do what he did, but it didn't seem like a stretch to pull that off. Either way, communication mistake, but Edmure suffers the backlash.
A Storm of Swords, Catelyn 2. The Blackfish cleared his throat and said,
I think we've all heard sufficient of your boasting, nephew.
Edmure was taken aback. Boasting? What do you mean?
I mean, said the Blackfish, that you owe his grace your thanks for his forbearance. He played out that mummer's farce in the Great Hall so as to not shame you before your own people. Had it been me, I would have flayed you for your stupidity rather than praising this folly of the Fords.
So perhaps this is Brynden and Robb bearing some pride and wanting to blame Edmure instead of blaming themselves for not giving better orders. Or perhaps they did give better orders and Edmure, just kind of took it upon himself. We weren't there for the conversation of what was said to Edmure. But as we know, this is just the start of Robb's troubles. It went so well for a while, and then it started to go downhill. Not long after this, he's forced to sentence Lord Rickard Karstark to death, and Blackfish comes into this as someone who gets asked for advice. But his advice isn't great. Soon, Hoster finally dies. It might not have affected Robb all that much, but it definitely rocked the worlds of Catelyn and Brynden. One lost a father, the other lost the older brother he'd been arguing with for half his life, but whom he still loved despite all that. One of the cooler Blackfish moments in both the show and the book is that Tully funeral for Hoster. When Edmure misses the funeral boat with a flaming arrow several times, he thrusts the bow to Sir Brynden, who nails the shot with one try. And, of course, it's pointed out that Hoster missed his first shot too, but his second shot got there.
The Red Wedding.
As valuable as Blackfish was with planning battles and strategy, he wasn't much help with politics, something Robb sorely needed. The incident with Rickard Karstark and then the Jane Westerling situation showed the need for skilled political thinking, because these were hard to handle and they weren't battlefield situations, which was the only thing, an important thing, but the only thing that Robb and his team seemed to be great at. Robb lamented, saying, "I should have thought of this," referring to the idea of trading Jaime for Sansa, then marrying Sansa to Loras Tyrell, bringing the Reach into the war on their side. Or, Robert Arryn might have worked just as well. But either way, that idea wasn't proposed, apparently. Robb acts like that idea was never brought up, which means neither Catelyn nor Blackfish nor any of the other lords had this idea. And it's kind of an obvious idea. Blackfish or Robb or Ned, all these guys are soldiers first, not politicians. It really shows. They really needed someone like Hoster Tully himself, whose illness kind of took him out of the picture until he died. He's the kind of guy that would have seen some of these angles. He was a political guy. And this might have been what Walder Frey and Tywin Lannister realized, that, hey, Hoster's out of the way. You got this young kid, you got this, his uncle, who's just this battle-tested guy that has no political experience, basically. He might have realized this is where we can win this war. Not on the battlefield, but, in the deal-making room, whatever you want to call it. Just like you would want Brynden on your side if you might suspect an ambush, he'd be the perfect guy to help sniff that out. But this kind of trap, the Red Wedding, I don't know if he would have been the right man for that, but we don't know because he wasn't there. Edmure married Rosalind, with Robb along to offer his apologies, which was a condition of the alliance trap. He took his mother and uncle, not his great-uncle. Brynden was left behind to protect Riverrun, and he had a new title to accompany it, Warden of the Southern Marches. As the party leaves, Catelyn sums up her confidence in the idea of Blackfish being the one left behind to guard them.
A Storm of Swords, Catelyn 5. Queen Jane would be safest behind the high, strong walls of Riverrun with the Blackfish to protect her. Robb had even created him a new title, Warden of the Southern Marches. Sir Brynden would hold the Trident, if any man could. All the same, Catelyn would miss her uncle's craggy face, and Robb would miss his counsel. Sir Brynden had played a part in every victory her son had won. Galbert Glover had taken command of the Scouts and Outriders in his place. A good man, loyal and steady, but without the Blackfish's brilliance.
We all know what actually happened at the Red Wedding. Don't need to rehash that. Don't need to guess how it affected Brynden much either. His nephew is captured, likely to die from where he's sitting, and his great-nephew and king slaughtered. Catelyn, his niece, who he'd held hands with at his brother's funeral, had her throat cut and thrown naked in the river. Only Lysa was left in the world, and she was to die not long after. Brynden had fought his way back to his family, helped rescue them from siege, only to see them lose and die anyway outside of battle, while the niece he left behind was also killed, also not in battle. That left him basically alone again, without much family to speak of. Well, there's still duty and honor, though.
Warden of the Southern Marches.
Brynden not being a meek nor mild man, Riverrun remained defiant even when the nasty old phrase came a-knockin'. Here's where opinions differ greatly on Blackfish. When Riverrun was originally threatened, Edmure brought in all the small folk to take refuge within the castle walls. Brynden did the opposite. Citing that more mouths need more food, and knowing the Freys are coming to siege, the Blackfish kicks them all out, leaving them to their own defense.
A Feast for Crows, Jaime 5. Can we starve the castle out? Sir Davin shook his head. The Blackfish expelled all the useless mouse from Riverrun and picked this country clean. He has enough stores to keep man and horse alive for 2 full years.
That's pretty bad. But he's also not wrong. He knows there's a siege coming. He knows there isn't going to be help for a while. All the River Lords minus Tytos Blackwood are bending the knee. Without the small folk, he can perhaps hold off the Freys for 2 years. If he keeps them, not so long at all. So it's a pretty difficult choice. Brynden knows he's going to be vilified for it, but he does it anyway. And he also scoured the surrounding land, as we said earlier, so the Freys couldn't use the surrounding land for their own food, but neither could those small folk. So he was tasked with holding Riverrun, and he was going to hold it, despite having to do awful things to reach that goal. There's something we haven't mentioned yet, which is that Brynden had another task, and when Robb and the others went north, he left his young wife behind, the Queen Girl Jane, the one that Catelyn feels confident leaving behind because it's Brynden guarding her. And he intended to do that. He did his duty as best as he could. And when the Freys finally did arrive and threatened to hang Edmure, he didn't budge. After a short treatment, the siege leader, Ryman Frey, begins to bring Edmure before the gallows, which we know was just a bluff, and Blackfish called it. Again and again and again he calls it. His bluff is repeated over and over, but of course it just gets easier to call over and over probably. Does he know Ryman is full of it? Or is he just, well, this is my job. It doesn't matter if you hang Edmure. I got orders from the king, and that takes precedence. Or maybe it's just because he realizes that if he opens the gates, Edmure's screwed either way. It's not like it would save him. So, and also there's this whole Brynden maybe not wanting to be told what to do, just being stubborn.
A Feast for Crows, Jaime 5. I would, but where to begin? Whilst I've been building rams and siege towers, Ryman Frey has raised a gibbet. Every day at dawn he brings forth Edmure Tully, drapes a noose around his neck, and threatens to hang him unless the castle yields. The Blackfish pays his mummers show no mind, so come evenfall, Lord Edmure is taken down again.
So this goes on and on with neither side budging until Jaime shows up with more men and a better plan. He actually gets Brynden to a parley on the Riverrun drawbridge, and Jaime has, decent intentions. We know from his internal point of view that he's a lot different man than he is at the beginning of the series. Brynden Blackfish doesn't know this. Brynden mistrusts Jaime from the start, repeatedly calling him Kingslayer, not really even entertaining Jaime's offers. He basically says, I'm only out here because I'm bored.
A Feast for Crows, Jaime 6. Are there any terms you will accept? He demanded of the Blackfish.
From you?
Sir Brynden shrugged.
No.
Why did you even come to treat with me?
A siege is deadly dull. I wanted to see this stump of yours and hear whatever excuses you cared to offer up for your latest enormities. They were feebler than I'd hoped. You'd always disappoint, Kingslayer.
The Blackfish wheeled his mare and trotted back toward Riverrun.
As I mentioned earlier, Brynden was a major hero of Jaime's when Jaime was young. So this is a pretty important point for Jaime's arc, one that George has repeated in a few places, which is the realism of meeting your heroes, your personal heroes. Usually, the hero, the person, doesn't measure up to the stories told about them. In this case, that's not the problem at all. Brynden does live up. It's just that Brynden just hates Jaime and understandably is upset about the Red Wedding, calls Jaime's honor into question, and as someone that, adheres to a code of honor, Brynden, for the most part, he just, has nothing but disdain for Jaime. So imagine being Jaime and having someone you idolize just look down on you with disdain like that. Doesn't feel good. I mean, Jaime can handle it. He's an adult, but still, it didn't feel good. But he does his best impression of Tywin, being dispassionate, doing his thing while holding a war council. And this is interesting because a lot of the River Lords are in this council, and they have this great high opinion of Blackfish. Stubborn, to be respected. And this war council includes the aforementioned Norbert Vance, now old and blind, who, remember, Brynden squired with him. He offers to try to talk to Brynden and maybe convince him, a familiar face. But that's not what happens. Jaime instead goes himself to Edmure, convinces him to release Riverrun because he's the Lord of Riverrun. And, and if you don't, I'm going to, shoot your kid on a trebuchet. So this finally works. The Lannisters and Freys take the castle, but they have a little bit of a surprise when they take control.
A Feast for Crows, Jaime 7.
He did swim,
said Edmure, sullenly. He had the same blue eyes as his sister Catelyn, and Jaime saw the same loathing that he'd once seen in hers.
We raised the portcullis on the water gate. Not all the way, just 3 feet or so. Enough to leave a gap under the water, though the gate still appeared to be closed. My uncle is a strong swimmer. After dark, he pulled himself beneath the spikes.
So Brynden manages to pull off one of the better escapes in the series, kind of like his namesake's archenemy Bittersteel, swimming under a barely raised portcullis and swimming down a river. That's a pretty impressive feat for any man, let alone one approaching his 60s. Though he did grow up in the Riverlands, which probably means he knows how to swim. And that's the last we see of Brynden Blackfish as he heads out into the Riverlands. Jaime sends scouts after him, hunting parties, is pretty confident that they'll catch him, but they don't. Throughout this episode, we've made a lot of comparisons between Brynden and Barristan Selmy, and here's yet another. The two were similar in their youth and similar in their later years. Both were dismissed/chased out by Lannisters, as it goes, and forced to go on the run and to find a new/old cause. In the case of Barristan, Tywin makes a shrewd point.
A Game of Thrones, Tyrion 9.
And dismissing Selmy, where was the sense in that? Yes, the man was old, but the name of Barristan the Bold still has meaning in the realm. He lent honor to any man he served.
Tywin was dead on. The name Barristan the Bold held a lot of esteem, and so does the name Blackfish. As with Barristan being dismissed/disappearing with no one really knowing where to find him until he popped up to support Daenerys, we can assume Brynden is going to do a very similar thing. Although it won't involve going to Essos or Daenerys. It's worth noting that Jaime claims he intended to let Blackfish take the black. Yeah, his name kind of already fits it, right? But no. I think Jaime's telling the truth there, but it's not a sure thing. But you could argue that Brynden would rather die defending his homeland anyway. It's interesting to consider, though, what he would have thought of such an offer. We know the Night's Watch is desperate for men. Someone like Brynden would be really helpful right there, and he's already got the right color cult clothing to go along with it. But Brynden seems to share his niece's disdain for Lord Commander Jon Snow, right? Catelyn hated Jon Snow, and Brynden may not have a great opinion of him, but in the conversation with Jaime, he indicates that he doesn't trust Jon. Maybe he's just saying that because he doesn't want, maybe he's doing a mummer impersonation here to prevent Jon from becoming a target. If he just disavows friendship or interest in Jon, maybe that helps keep Jon safer. Remember, Robb names Jon his heir in his will, and maybe Blackfish knows this. Because Blackfish wasn't there, he was already left behind when Robb wrote his will. Robb wrote his will after having left Blackfish behind, so he might not know about it. But if he did, this would definitely, he wouldn't want to say, yeah, I like Jon Snow. He would want to be like, I hate that guy. I don't, he's got nothing to do with me. He would want to keep him safe. But it's kind of fun to imagine the possibilities there, because it could be just a simple, straightforward, Catelyn mentioned him, and so he shares the opinion of his niece there. But we don't know what he did. We don't know where he went. We don't know whether he knows about Jon being the heir, and we don't know where he's going. But we definitely have some great ideas that I think you'll like.
Future fish.
So there are many possibilities for what the Blackfish can do with his relative freedom. Even though he's a hunted man, he is out there and capable. It's a safe bet that the Tully words, though, that's where we should look to kind of get a guideline. Honor, I think, will take distant third place right now, because family and duty are really going to demand his time. And he doesn't exactly have a lot of family out there, so it really helps us narrow it down. Edmure is obvious as a possibility, but there's also Arya and Sansa and Robert Arryn, who is his great nephew. He has no idea where Arya and Sansa are, for the most part, so there's not a lot of reason for him to think about them. And of course, I left out Brandon Rickon because, like most people, he thinks they're dead. Speaking of dead, well, it's probably going to be not long, unless it's already happened off screen, that he's found out about Catelyn. So that's his family. But his greatest duty is to his deceased king, who is also a great nephew, and Robb's queen, Jane Westerling, who he's sworn to protect. So let's see what happens next.
The Brotherhood without Blackfish.
There's an outside chance that Brynden is going to head back to the Vale. He's obviously going to have ties there because of Sweet Robin. And Sweet Robin is a young man with no one to protect him, and Peter Baelish is in charge of him, so that's a risky bridge to build on now, though, because that's kind of far away, and we don't really know what Brynden knows about Littlefinger and what opinion he has of him, but he's probably not a fan. The other aspect is that one of his last kin is in the Vale with Sansa. But he doesn't know that either, like we said earlier. It would be interesting if he goes there, because if he sees her, I mean, Littlefinger points out repeatedly that Sansa is the spitting image of Catelyn at the same age. And of course, Brynden would catch that too, if he sees her. If he sees her. But it doesn't seem likely. But if he does, if she sees him, is that maybe her way out? Be like, hey, uncle, get me the heck out of here. But Littlefinger would see that coming. If Blackfish shows up, he's going to know, oh, better hide her. But I don't think this is very likely. I think that the Riverlands is far more likely. It's his home, it's where the kingdom is, and it's where, where his most important family members are. So seeking out the Brotherhood without banners seems by far the most likely. It's also what Jaime is worried about him doing. The new Lord of Riverrun, Emmon Frey, freaked out when he heard Blackfish escaped. They perhaps have already sought him out, meaning the Brotherhood. Here's why. Jaime leaves Edmure alone with Tom O'Sevens, the singer, a scene clearly not meant for casual fans to get. Not only is Tom the same singer who made the song mocking Edmure's floppy fish, Jaime thinks he's tormenting Edmure by leaving him alone with him, and that is what it looks like. But Tom is a member of the Brotherhood without banners, and no doubt they had a very interesting conversation, him and Edmure. One might think Blackfish came up in that conversation and his need to escape. This is a potential match made in heaven. Check this out. By this point in the story, the Brotherhood is already killing Freys left, right, and center. Brendan's going to be all about that. He would also be aware that through all the war, the Brotherhood have been helping out the small folk, killing Lannisters, and generally siding with the Tullys, at least siding with their agenda. So that certainly makes sense and is a great fit. And of course, you haven't forgotten Brendan's skill set that he displayed not only in the War of the Five Kings, but probably before. The Brotherhood are good at what they do, but Brynden is a master of this sort of thing. His experience with scouts, knowing the land, knowing the enemy, just tactics, all that stuff. Brynden would be perfect as a new type commander of the Brotherhood. They would just do so well under him. Mixing them with his level of expertise it's pretty exciting, I got to say. But the interesting part about all this is, it's really hard to predict, is again meeting his niece, Lady Stoneheart. What is he going to do? What is he going to react to her? Is it going to really creep him out? Or is he just going to roll with it? Be like, well, she's killing Freys and Lannisters, and that's what I want to do. This is creepy as heck, but it's working. Or would he just get really angry? Would he be like, this is wrong. This is just, some sort of the work of the seven hells or something. I don't know what he would call it, but maybe he would want to end her suffering, or I don't know. This is a difficult call here. But as long as he has living family, that's going to take priority over revenge, even though revenge might be easier to get at this point. I do think with his skills, he might be able to manage both. Let's keep that in mind. We know Jaime and Brienne are headed back to Lady Stoneheart, so perhaps this is even an opportunity for Brynden and Jaime to meet again, because Brynden may already be with them. At that point, in which Brienne comes and tricks Jaime to leave his army, Blackfish may be already among them. So we may get some back and forth between Jaime and the Blackfish again, and maybe we'll see Brienne and Blackfish do some chatting. That would be kind of cool.
The Brotherhood with Blackfish.
We've been looking at everything through a Brynden-tinted lens. That's hard to say fast. Given that this is an episode about him, but let's take a look from another point of view. The Brotherhood's in this case. Obviously, they're going to be aware of who he is, but it goes farther than that. A good number of the lads in the Brotherhood are simple folk from the Riverlands. They aren't professional soldiers. They don't raise banners, hence the name. They're simply just swept up in the carnage of war. But all of them, to a man, have heard of the Blackfish. They've been fighting the Freys It's been a hard war. It's been a hard life. And then in walks this hero that they've been hearing stories about since they were born. A knight famous outside of the Riverlands, throughout the entire Seven Kingdoms. So this is a game changer for them. It's like morale is really important in war, and getting this guy on their side, boom, that's a huge boost to morale all around. And the Brotherhood are not, it's like I said, it's a hard life. They're falling apart a bit, So this could really pump some energy into them. And, remember how Jaime grew up idolizing the Blackfish? And Jaime is the son of the most powerful lord in the kingdom and the youngest ever to join the Kingsguard. And he idolizes Blackfish. So if Jaime feels that way, just imagine how the small folk feel about the Blackfish. And as we mentioned with Barristan, honor and fame are part of the package. After months or years of living in caves and hanging people, commanded by a walking corpse, Blackfish again, coming in there, that's going to shine a little light on things. And of course, the non-Riverlanders, it's still the name Tully. I mean, the Tullys are one of the great houses, and they get to serve under him, and not an undead Tully, which they were serving under before. It lends purpose, and it might even be possible that a few of these outliers can be maybe redeemed. Being around Brynden, maybe it's those who survive the war, if any of them do. Being around a guy like him might, having a trickle-down effect on their personalities. Maybe it'll make them more honorable in the long run. And since Lady Stoneheart started calling the shots, they have not exactly behaved with honor. They've gotten darker and darker, which is possibly why Brynden won't get along with this group so well. As great a fit as it seems, it might not actually work out. So it just comes down to what his attitude's going to be, what his goals are going to be, and how other people view him. He's not terribly sentimental or compassionate. So he might be willing to get his hands dirty, to work with the undead, to work with, these bandits, if it means killing Lannisters and Freys.
Hips do lie, after all.
So for a while, there was a popular theory that Brynden escaped with Jane Westerling, whom many believed to be pregnant with Robb's heir, and was trying to get her safety. Ignoring the considerable logistics of helping a pregnant young woman swim through the river, there's a roadblock to this theory. The reason the theory exists is because Catelyn and Jaime's description of Jane Westerling's hips were very different. And this is, of course, would normally be major evidence. Unfortunately, George confirmed that it was a mistake. So that's it. The hips, they do lie. So we just have to lay that theory to rest. So Brynden's almost certainly by himself. So where's he going to go? Obviously, we talked about the Brotherhood being kind of hard to find, but of course, they may have found him. And Jaime's War Council, and in various conversations, it's pretty clear that a lot of the Riverlords aren't happy with their current circumstance. So if things start to turn, and they hear that Brynden is part of the reason why, it may encourage them to switch sides sooner than they might have, because of their hero being out there doing the work that they, by honor, feel that they should be doing too. It probably shamed a lot of them to bend the knees to the Lannisters, and they would love to have a second chance to do the right thing. There's even the outside chance that he goes north, right? To Mage Mormont and to do all that. But I really don't think so. We should consider it, but he's a Riverlands man, and he's a family man, and he probably wants revenge. And revenge is there, where he already is. No need to go anywhere else. So in summary, Brynden is quiet, except when he's not, plain and reserved, giving him an air of mystery in addition to his badassery. And he loves his family and his home, but he also expelled hundreds of smallfolk and was willing for the garrison of Riverrun to die if it meant taking a few thousand Freys and Lannisters with them, despite the fact that it seemed certain that no military victory could be achieved. Is this an endearing last stand or pointless stubbornness or pride? It's one of the most divisive opinions among fans about a single character. It's probably one of those arguments that's going to live forever. We're not going to know. It's a moral conundrum. Brynden is also a key example, despite being a simple character, of being complex at the same time. Sure, he's a knight, a shining beacon of honor, but he's a master of ambush, of scouting, and tactical advantage, not traits generally connected to knighthood. This could be a decent clue that honor is something that Brynden adheres to where possible, and something he'll put aside when he needs to. When push comes to shove, he wants results, not glory, especially when family weighs in the balance. He's certainly not perfect by any standard, but among the Westerosi characters we know well, he's one of the better ones, as far as morals and ethics go, but still far from perfect. Another comparison to Barristan Selmy here, who we see struggle with his possible past choices, like Dany and Meereen, and due to oaths he's sworn, and how the politics are all just the kind of thing he doesn't want to be involved with. I would think Brynden would also not take as long to make a decision. More importantly, though, is who Brynden has been. An acclaimed warrior in the War of Ninepenny Kings, a steadfast rock against the tide of tradition in terms of marriage, a clearly loving uncle, and a difference maker in the War of Five Kings. He shows us another side of the old knights that litter the story and provides a complex juxtaposition as a man who both loves his family and yet is willing to be separate from it entirely. There's no character like him. Without a doubt, there's only one Blackfish in those rivers.
Stay tuned after the credits for a brief extra thought on the Blackfish's future based on a To the Winds of Winter spoiler. The producer of this episode was Ashea. Thanks to Michael Klarfeld for the video intro and outro. Thanks to Joey Townsend and Jesse Kowal for the intro and outro music. Thanks to McCall Schick of Vassals of Kingsgrave podcast and Hypable.com for the female voices. Thanks to Martin Lewis of Echoes of Ice and Fire for the section readings. Thanks again to Joe Buckley and Rhaenys Targaryen for helping write this episode. Thanks to Lord Rob the Built, Stoneborn rider of the Unicorn Desolation. Thanks to the mysterious BR, Hand of the King. Thanks to Lord Michael Velaryon, Knight of High Tide and Guardian of the DeLorean, Hand of the Queen. Lady Suthan Sinistrel, the Learned, holder of the left-handed Valyrian shears called Penance, Hand of the Beard. Lord Jim the Fortuitous of Wars and Politics of Ice and Fire blog and Warden of the West and host of the Two-Waged War podcast. Lord George Stormsville the Cunning, Lord of the Chiliad and Warden of the East. Kabeth the Unfrozen is Lord of the Bricks and Castle Crimson Light, Defender of the Old Gods and Warden of the North. Lady Kelly McMath of Covington is Lady of the Villa Hills and Crescent Springs, Warden of the South. Lord James Tuttle is King of the Stepstones and the Narrow Sea, Commander of the Royal Fleet consisting of the Narrow Fleet led by Flagship Caraxes and the Bloodstone Fleet led by Flagship Prince Daemon. Charlotte Oster is Corsair Queen of the Western Shivering Sea, Commander of the Briny Fleet, whose flagship is the barnacle-encrusted Violet-hulled Mercenaria. She carries the nacre-inlaid Shucking Blade Crasslover. Ships from both fleets have been engaged in battle in recent days, and the conflict could escalate, thanks to Sir Valentin of House Jen, creator of the Game of Predictions. Our small council is Lord James Inkblade, the Scholar Knight, Master of Whisperers, Grand Maester Saria of the Barrows, Cinder of the Citadel, Lord Robert Jacobs, Master of Coin, Rosie the Clever, Master of Laws. Lords and ladies in their castles include Lady Direliz of Castle Naki, the Alpha Patron, Lord Dan of the Red Mountains and Castle Great Bell, Breaker of the Second Stone, Lord Skip of the Veldt, Lord of Castle Ganges, Gregor the Toasty, Lord of the Breadfort, Alicia Everlasting of the Greenblood, Lady of Desert Rose, Lord Ryan of Castle Stonegate, Guardian of the Rocky Mountain Pass, Lord Garin de Haviland of Devil's Hand Keep, Ashlyn Winter, the Hawk's Eye, Lady of Castle Skyfall, Lady Mikkel of Moonacre, leader of the Werewood Protectorate Alliance. The Lord of the Halls of Castle Hillcrest is wielder of the Valyrian steel machete Everglazed. Lord Alistair Whitaker is Lord of the Dawnhold. Lord Bemmy Snugglebunny is guardian of the Hidden 100-Acre Werewood and holder of the Vorkal Snugglebunny. Brian the Defender is Lord of the Spearfort and the Freelands, last scion of Clan McCulloch, strength and courage. The Bastard of the Wolfswood is first forester of the Old Gods, sworn to House Ironwarewood. Listen for the silence. Connor the Dungeon Master is Lord of Catamount Keep and guardian of the Smoky Mountain Pass. Lady Baelish is Dark Widow of Harrenhal. Our King's Justice is Sir Troy the Steady, wielder of the Valyrian steel blade Fate. Our Queen's High Council is Lady Jane of House Celtigar, the Emerald of the Evening, wielder of the Valyrian steel axe Painkiller, Mistress of Sea Eagles, and Mistress of Ships. Lady Mai of House Swan is Mistress of Whispers. Elia of Upstate is Master of Coin. Grand Maester M. Elizabeth is middle daughter of Lyanna Mormont, First Lady to forge both the Silver and Valyrian Steel Link. Bold Betha of House Copperhook is Still Waters Run Deep, Master of Laws. The Council of the Beard is led by Grand Maester Clark, Protector of Wisdom and Beards. Our Kingsguard is led by Lord Commander Sir Christopher Dane of Starfall, Sentinel of the Torrentine. Our Queen's Guard is led by Lord Captain Commander Helena Hellman, the Sellsword Sentinel. Lady Nymeria of House Seapurtle, Alexander of House Atreides, from the seat of Dune, I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Jane Grey, Becca the Bard, Songbird of the North, and Sir Eric Redbeard Odinson, wielder of Tempest, a monstrous warhammer. The Beard Guard is Lord Commander George the Golden, Sir Joshua Oakhart the White Oak, Lady Rita the Coppermane, the Unbound, Dance the Fervor. Sir Jeff, Warden of the AC, wielder of Triad, the multifaceted beard of platinum, red, and brown. Stay frosty. Lord Commander Daenerys Flint of the Night Fort, avenging the memory of brave Dany. First Ranger Fabian Flowers, the bastard of Greenshield. First Builder Patchface of Motley Wisdom. And First Steward Sir Jurian of the Torrentide, called Palewind.
As I said during the intro, I had a little extra tidbit that I was going to save after the credits. And the reason, of course, is because it involves a Winds of Winter spoiler. Not from one of the Winds of Winter chapters, but something George said in an interview. Now, of course, there's a lot of Winds of Winter fan theories, including Brynden, like the attempted rescue of Edmure and Jane Westerling, because they're being moved from Riverrun to Casterly Rock. And Jaime is very worried about this. He gives Forley Prester, a knight who Jaime trusts, 100 men, and then says, double it. And then he says double it again as his suspicions grow, and he thinks about it more. He's worried about the possibility of ambush. And here's where the little TWOW spoiler comes in. George said that the prologue of the Winds of Winter will include Jane Westerling. So include her probably means that she's not the point of view. It might be Prester himself. It could be Blackfish himself. It could be one of the other characters in this party. But there's a decent chance that we see Blackfish in the prologue of the Winds of Winter, involving some sort of attempt to bring Jane Westerling back, to capture her, to get her back, to rescue her, etc. And I'm very much looking forward to that. It's one of the fun things about this episode that gives it a little extra juice, is the idea that Brynden might be one of the very first characters we see when we finally get the Winds of Winter, whenever that comes. So that's it. That's all a little tidbit is. We don't have much to go on, of course, because it's just a little snippet from George, but it's definitely worth thinking about. And that's it for today. Thanks, everybody, for listening. See you next time.